The air in Buckingham Palace that evening was heavy, almost suffocating, as though the building itself knew something monumental was about to unfold. It was past midnight, the hours when silence seems more profound, when shadows stretch unnaturally along the ornate corridors, and the echo of a single footstep seems louder than a thunderclap. Princess Charlotte, no older than 9, tiptoed carefully along the polished marble floors, her small hand gripping the banister as if it could anchor her courage. Her heart thumped wildly, not from exertion, but from anticipation, an intuition that she was about to witness something that would change everything she thought she knew about her family, her world, and the history she had only glimpsed in fragments. Charlotte had always been observant, more so than most children her age. She noticed the smallest details. A slight tension in her father's jaw, a fleeting shadow in a hallway, a whispered conversation abruptly ended when she entered the room. That night, the palace felt different. Tense. Electric. Even the usual comforting warmth of her room, filled with her toys and drawings, seemed distant. Something had shifted. She could feel it in her chest, a weight that pressed against her ribs, a premonition she could not name but could not ignore. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. She had been wandering near the East Wing, where the royal family's private chambers lay hidden behind security doors and staff-only signs. Usually, she would not have ventured this far without permission, but curiosity had a way of overpowering caution, especially for a child with a mind that absorbed more than anyone suspected. That night, as she passed the gilded doors, she heard it. A voice, unmistakable and commanding, speaking in tones that were low but carrying a tension that seemed to vibrate through the hallway. The voice was familiar, yet it carried a weight she had never encountered before. It was Queen Camilla. Charlotte froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her instinct told her to retreat, to return to the safety of her quarters, but something rooted her to the spot. The voice was unmistakable. It was intimate, almost conspiratorial, as if the speaker believed she was entirely alone. Charlotte pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear the words, her young mind unable to fully process the gravity of what was being said, yet feeling it in every fiber of her being. She never deserved to survive. The world had to see her gone. Camilla's words floated out into the hallway, each syllable deliberate, chilling, and loaded with intent. The clarity of the statement made Charlotte's stomach drop. At first, she thought she had misheard. Perhaps, in the shadowy quiet of the palace, her imagination was crafting horrors from fragments. But the second sentence that followed left no room for doubt. "I made sure it happened," Camilla continued, her tone cold, controlled, yet oddly triumphant, as though confessing to a long-kept secret that carried immense power. Charlotte's mind recoiled. She had heard about Princess Diana's tragic death countless times, through hushed conversations and television clips, but the idea that someone within the royal circle could have orchestrated such a tragedy was something she had never imagined. And yet, here it was, whispered in a way that seemed to carve itself into her memory, as if the walls themselves wanted to hold her captive in this moment of revelation. Her first instinct was disbelief. Could she be hearing this correctly? Could the queen, someone who had always seemed untouchable, be confessing to one of the darkest events in modern royal history? Her pulse raced, her hands trembled slightly, and a chill ran down her spine. Charlotte's thoughts spiraled. If she told anyone, would they believe her? Could a child's word carry weight against a queen? Or would it be dismissed, leaving her vulnerable to consequences she could not even imagine? Charlotte backed slowly down the corridor, trying to keep her small footsteps silent. Every nerve in her body screamed that she was holding a secret more dangerous than any she had ever known. Yet the weight of that knowledge pressed down on her young shoulders, demanding action. She knew she could not remain silent, yet she also knew that speaking out could unleash chaos not just in her family, but across the world. The palace, with all its grandeur and history, suddenly felt like a labyrinth of secrets, where every turn could conceal danger or betrayal. When she finally reached her room, Charlotte collapsed onto her bed, her mind racing. How could this be happening? She replayed the words over and over, each repetition making them feel more real. She tried to make sense of them. "I made sure it happened." The clarity, The finality, the audacity of the statement made her feel as if the floor beneath her had vanished. She had overheard something that could shake the monarchy to its core. Something that, if revealed, would rewrite history. Charlotte knew she needed guidance, someone she could trust implicitly. Her first thought was to confide in the aides who had always shown kindness and patience, who had helped her navigate the complex etiquette of royal life. Yet, even in their presence, she felt the immense weight of fear. How could a child convey such a story convincingly? How could she protect herself and her family while bringing the truth to light? The questions tumbled in her mind, relentless and unyielding. Meanwhile, in the East Wing, Camilla remained oblivious, or perhaps confident in her perceived invincibility. She had always maneuvered through palace intrigue with a mix of strategy, charm, and ruthlessness. But Charlotte's presence, unnoticed yet attentive, changed everything. A secret meant to remain hidden within the walls of the palace had now found a witness, someone young, impressionable, but unexpectedly resilient. The balance of power, so carefully maintained for decades, had been subtly, yet irrevocably, shifted. The hours dragged on as Charlotte wrestled with the knowledge she now carried. The palace was silent outside her room, the distant ticking of clocks and faint hum of security systems the only sounds keeping her company. Sleep eluded her. Dreams of whispers, shadows, and a world turned upside down filled her mind. She knew the next steps were crucial. Every decision carried weight. Every hesitation could alter the course of history. By dawn, Charlotte had resolved to act, to confide in those she trusted. She approached her loyal aides, her voice trembling yet determined, as she relayed the chilling words she had overheard. The reactions were immediate: wide-eyed disbelief, whispered consultations, and a sudden, palpable tension that spread through the household. The gravity of her revelation was not lost on them. They understood that this was not a mere child's imagination, but a statement that could, if true, shatter reputations, rewrite narratives, and spark global outrage. As the palace awoke, with staff preparing for the day's routines, the undercurrent of unease was undeniable. The secret Charlotte had uncovered hung invisibly in the air, unseen but heavy, waiting for the world to acknowledge it. News, power, and family honor were suddenly entwined in ways no one could have anticipated, and Charlotte, though just a child, had unwittingly become the epicenter of a historical maelstrom. Every step Charlotte took after that moment carried caution, strategy, and courage. She moved through the palace corridors with a newfound awareness, understanding that she now possessed knowledge that could topple the seemingly unassailable. Friends and confidants listened intently, processing the implications, weighing risks, and questioning loyalties. The stage was set for an unprecedented chain of events, a cascade of revelations that would pull back the veil on the royal family in ways the world had never seen. It was in these quiet, tension-filled hours that Charlotte realized something profound. Knowledge is power, but it is also responsibility. The secret she carried could liberate truth, or it could destroy lives. She would have to navigate this labyrinth of fear, influence, and history with care, courage, and an intuition far beyond her years. The first step had been taken. The secret was out of the shadows, and nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after Charlotte had overheard the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life began quietly, deceptively ordinary, as if the world had no idea the secret now lurking within its walls. The sun crept over the horizon, casting golden light across the manicured gardens of Buckingham Palace, illuminating the fountains, the stately balconies, and the wide windows that framed rooms where history was made and secrets carefully hidden. Inside, the palace hummed with activity, staff moving swiftly to prepare breakfast, security personnel checking routines, and aides ensuring that the day's schedule for the royal children was meticulously followed. Everything appeared routine, almost mundane. Yet beneath the veneer of normalcy, a tension had been quietly ignited, a spark that threatened to erupt into an inferno. Charlotte, still shaken from the previous night, awoke with a heavy sense of responsibility pressing down on her young shoulders. She had spent hours replaying Camilla's words, each syllable etched into her memory with terrifying clarity. She remembered the tone, the inflection, the cold finality in Camilla's voice. "I made sure it happened." Even now, hours later, Charlotte's stomach churned at the thought. She knew, with a clarity no child should possess, that what she had heard was not idle gossip or careless words. It was a confession that could alter the course of history, and one she was expected to guard in silence. Charlotte dressed in quiet haste, choosing an outfit that was both comfortable and unobtrusive, aware that her presence in the palace corridors would soon be noticed. She moved with care, each step deliberate, as if the polished floors themselves could betray her intentions. Her mind raced with questions. Could she trust anyone? How much of this truth could she safely reveal? What would happen if she spoke too loudly, too confidently, too soon? Every instinct screamed caution, yet her sense of justice, her innate understanding of right and wrong, demanded action. She could not simply let these words vanish into the air, leaving the truth buried beneath decades of royal protocol and carefully curated public appearances. Her first stop was the nursery wing, where her younger siblings were beginning their day. Prince Louis, unaware of the monumental events that had unfolded in the dark hours before dawn, giggled as he played with a set of building blocks, stacking them carefully only to knock them down in gleeful abandon. Charlotte knelt beside him, attempting to mask the storm raging inside her. She offered a gentle smile, though it barely reached her eyes, and carefully guided him through the morning routine. In these small moments, she found grounding, a semblance of normalcy amid chaos. Yet even as she helped her brother, she knew the palace was no longer a place where innocence could remain untouched. By mid-morning, Charlotte had summoned the courage to approach one of her most trusted aides, a woman who had served the family for years and whose loyalty was unwavering. Charlotte's voice trembled as she recounted what she had overheard, the confession of Camilla that had left her paralyzed with fear. The aide listened in stunned silence, eyes widening as the magnitude of Charlotte's revelation sank in. She had expected to hear childish imagination, perhaps a distorted retelling of a fragment overheard. What she received instead was a statement so precise, so chillingly deliberate, that it demanded acknowledgement. Word of Charlotte's disclosure, though confined to the inner circle of aides, rippled quickly through the palace. There were hushed meetings in small, secure rooms, whispers exchanged over locked doors, and urgent phone calls to legal advisors and security teams. The aides understood that the moment they were living through was unprecedented. A confession of complicity in Princess Diana's tragic death, heard firsthand by the youngest generation of the royal family, was a revelation that could not be contained by whispers alone. It demanded a response, careful strategy, and, most importantly, protection for Charlotte herself. Security measures were intensified immediately. Guards were stationed discreetly near Charlotte's quarters, and movement within the palace was monitored with renewed scrutiny. Every footstep, every conversation, every interaction became a potential risk. The aides knew that any misstep could expose Charlotte or, worse, allow the knowledge of her discovery to slip into the wrong hands. At the same time, they understood that Charlotte's own understanding of what she had witnessed was still evolving. The truth she carried was raw, unprocessed, and immensely powerful. Their task was twofold: safeguard her and begin the painstaking process of verifying and responding to the information she had provided. Meanwhile, news of Charlotte's revelation, though not yet public, began to reach those in positions of influence within the palace. Legal teams, private investigators, and even historians were quietly consulted, each tasked with assessing the credibility of the young princess's account. The questions were complex. Could a child's observation be taken seriously? How could such a statement, so explosive in nature, be corroborated? What legal and political implications would emerge if the claim were true? Each answer seemed to generate more questions, a cascade of uncertainty and fear that extended far beyond Charlotte herself. Amid this whirlwind of activity, Charlotte struggled to process her own emotions. Fear, confusion, guilt, and resolve collided within her, creating a storm of feelings she had no precedent for handling. She understood, perhaps more keenly than many adults, the weight of the secret she carried. It was not merely the words themselves, but the implications. The possibility that the very figurehead of the monarchy, a woman publicly revered and respected, could have been involved in the tragic demise of one of the world's most beloved figures. The thought made her shiver, yet also steeled her determination. She knew that silence was no longer an option. As the day unfolded, Charlotte's young mind began to formulate a plan. She could not confront Camilla directly. Such a move would be reckless, dangerous, and unlikely to yield any truth beyond what she already knew. Instead, she focused on gathering allies she could trust implicitly, individuals whose judgment, loyalty, and discretion were beyond reproach. These were people who had guided her through the intricate and often opaque world of royalty, who understood the nuances of protocol, and who recognized the moral imperative that sometimes outweighed tradition. Charlotte's first ally was her governess, a woman with decades of experience in royal education and child development. She approached her with caution, explaining the situation as clearly as a child of her age could. The governess listened intently, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock, then to resolute determination. She understood the gravity of the information and immediately began to consider the necessary steps, documenting the account, protecting Charlotte from exposure, and preparing for the inevitable chain reaction that such a revelation would trigger. In parallel, the palace's internal security teams began a thorough review of Camilla's recent activities. Meetings were held in secure, undisclosed locations, where aides and security officers analyzed patterns, communications, and movements. Every detail was scrutinized, from guest lists and private conversations to travel records and surveillance footage. The goal was clear: to determine the veracity of Charlotte's account without alerting the Queen herself. The tension within these rooms was palpable, a sense of urgency driving every decision and every whispered debate. By late afternoon, Charlotte had been debriefed multiple times by trusted adults. Each conversation, each retelling of Camilla's words, reinforced the reality of what she had heard. The aides worked tirelessly to protect her, but they also recognized that the clock was ticking. Secrets, particularly those of this magnitude, had a way of escaping even the most secure walls. The world outside Buckingham Palace, hungry for truth and scandal, could not remain ignorant forever. Charlotte, in her quiet courage, had become the catalyst for a revelation that would reverberate through history. Even as the palace staff worked behind the scenes, Charlotte grappled with the emotional weight of her knowledge. She could no longer return to the innocence of childhood. Her understanding of her family, of power, of history itself, had shifted irrevocably. She felt a strange mixture of fear and responsibility, a recognition that her actions now carried consequences far beyond her years. Every decision, every word, every gesture mattered. By evening, the aides convened a strategy session. They discussed how to protect Charlotte, how to assess the credibility of her account, and how to prepare for potential fallout. Legal advisors, historians, and even psychologists were consulted. The revelation of Camilla's alleged confession was not just a matter of palace intrigue. It was a historical and legal matter, with implications that could extend globally. Charlotte's voice, small but undeniably clear, had set in motion a series of events that no one could have anticipated, and the palace had to respond with precision, care, and foresight. Throughout the day, Charlotte remained both anxious and resolute. She knew the eyes of the world would eventually focus on her revelation. She knew the questions, the doubts, and the scrutiny that would accompany it. Yet she also knew that truth, once uncovered, could not be silenced. Her courage, though quiet and measured, was unwavering. In the face of overwhelming fear and unprecedented stakes, she had chosen to act, to speak, and to bear witness to words that could change history forever. As night fell over the palace once more, the corridors that had once seemed familiar now felt foreign and fraught with unseen threats. Charlotte lay in bed, reflecting on the day's events, aware that the journey she had embarked upon was only beginning. She had taken the first step into a world of secrets, lies, and revelations, a path that would challenge everything she had known about her family and the tension within Buckingham Palace had shifted from quiet undercurrent to an almost tangible force, pressing against walls, doors, and even the polished floors that reflected the afternoon sunlight. It was as if the very air itself had grown heavier, weighted with the unspoken implications of what young Charlotte had revealed. The aides, usually meticulous in their duties, now moved with cautious deliberation, each aware that a single misstep could have monumental consequences. Every whispered conversation, every glance exchanged across the hall, carried with it a sense of urgency that had never existed before. The first challenge facing the aides was belief. Charlotte's age, her position as a child within the royal family, made her account at once powerful and fragile. How could the words of a 7-year-old princess be verified, especially when they implicated one of the most influential figures in the monarchy? The aides wrestled with a gnawing fear. What if they dismissed her as imagining, mishearing, or exaggerating? And yet, every instinct told them otherwise. The clarity, precision, and chilling nature of Charlotte's recollection left no room for doubt. She had not only heard but understood. She had carried her fear and her moral certainty to the very adults entrusted with the palace's most sensitive affairs. Among the first to respond was Charlotte's governess, a woman with decades of experience in both education and palace affairs. She understood the stakes in a way that others, no matter how senior, might not. She recognized the combination of childlike honesty and acute observation that Charlotte possessed, a rare clarity that could pierce the carefully constructed facades of palace life. Her role became twofold: protect the child physically and emotionally, and begin the delicate process of navigating the adult world that Charlotte had inadvertently stepped into. Immediately, a small council of aides gathered in one of the palace's less conspicuous chambers. The room was intentionally nondescript, chosen to avoid any attention from staff who might unknowingly pass along information. The council included Charlotte's governess, her security detail, a senior royal aide, and a legal consultant who had experience handling sensitive matters within the monarchy. They faced a dilemma that was unprecedented in scale and severity. A minor had directly implicated the queen consort in the events leading to Princess Diana's death. The gravity of the allegation was staggering, its implications potentially explosive, and yet their first priority had to be the safety of the young princess. The discussion began cautiously. Each participant weighed words carefully, aware that even an offhand remark could alter the trajectory of the unfolding drama. The governess spoke first, her voice calm but urgent, emphasizing the need to treat Charlotte's disclosure with utmost seriousness. "This is not a matter of hearsay," she insisted. "Charlotte has heard something she should never have been exposed to, something that affects not just the family, but history itself. We must act, but with care. Above all, we must protect her." Security officers nodded in agreement, detailing the adjustments already made to Charlotte's routine. Access to her quarters was restricted, all movements monitored, and staff instructed to remain vigilant. The palace, always a labyrinth of rooms, corridors, and secret passages, had been transformed overnight into a controlled environment designed to safeguard a child carrying a revelation too powerful to be ignored. Yet even as they fortified Charlotte's physical safety, another layer of concern emerged: psychological well-being. Charlotte, though remarkably composed for her age, was a child processing trauma of an extraordinary scale. The aides recognized that every retelling of Camilla's words, every recounting of what she had overheard, risked both emotional exhaustion and a profound sense of isolation. They deliberated on how to support her without influencing or altering her account. The governess suggested structured conversations, frequent check-ins, and moments of normalcy interspersed with the intense security measures, a delicate balance between shielding and exposing, between nurturing and preparing. Legal counsel raised the next, and perhaps most challenging, question: credibility and potential fallout. How could Charlotte's account be substantiated, and what would the consequences be if it reached the public? The legal consultant emphasized caution, noting that even unproven allegations against a royal figure could ignite media frenzy, public outcry, and legal complications. "We must document everything," the consultant advised. "Every word, every gesture, every expression. We are in a position where Charlotte's observations may become central to historical record or, at the very least, legal proceedings. Precision is paramount." The aides began developing a framework. Charlotte would recount her experience repeatedly, in controlled settings, with multiple witnesses who could corroborate the consistency of her testimony. Audio and written records were considered, though extreme care was taken to ensure that such documentation could not be intercepted or misused. The palace's internal security team suggested a rotation of trusted personnel to observe and support Charlotte, ensuring that no single individual was solely responsible, a safeguard against both human error and potential manipulation. Meanwhile, discussions turned to the implications for Camilla. The aides knew that confronting or exposing her prematurely could trigger unpredictable reactions. The queen consort was a figure of immense influence and resourcefulness. She commanded loyalty, intelligence networks, and a capacity for strategic maneuvering. Any move by the aides had to be measured, precise, and legally defensible. There was a recognition, unspoken but universally understood, that even the most careful planning could not eliminate risk entirely. Every step forward was balanced against the potential for catastrophe. In parallel, the palace staff began to review historical events through a new lens. Movements on the night of Diana's fatal crash were scrutinized with renewed intensity. Records were re-examined, statements revisited, and timelines cross-referenced. The aides sought to determine whether any corroborating evidence, however subtle, could validate Charlotte's account. This retrospective analysis revealed gaps, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions that had been previously overlooked or dismissed. Each discovery, no matter how minor, was cataloged and evaluated. The tension mounted with every new piece of information, as the aides realized they were navigating a landscape where past tragedies, present revelations, and future consequences intersected with alarming complexity. Amid these deliberations, Charlotte remained the focal point. Her presence was both a source of clarity and a reminder of vulnerability. The aides worked tirelessly to shield her from media attention, casual observers, and even other members of the palace whose loyalty or discretion was uncertain. Every decision regarding her schedule, interactions, and environment was scrutinized for potential risk. Meals were planned, study sessions adjusted, and recreational activities carefully structured to provide both comfort and controlled exposure. In essence, Charlotte's world had been redesigned overnight to accommodate the burden of truth she now carried. Yet even with all precautions, the aides were aware that they could not insulate her entirely. Charlotte's words had power, and power has a tendency to seek expression. The reality of the situation was that the young princess's revelation had set in motion forces that could not be fully controlled. Allies were assembled, strategies developed, and measures implemented, but the uncertainty of human behavior, particularly that of Camilla herself, remained an unpredictable variable. The palace operated under a dual imperative: protect Charlotte and prepare for the inevitable confrontation with the truth she had uncovered. By the end of the day, the aides convened for a final review. Strategies were aligned, responsibilities assigned, and contingencies mapped out. Charlotte had been briefed in age-appropriate terms about the importance of discretion and the reasons for the heightened security measures. She had also been reassured that she was not alone, that her courage had been recognized, and that the adults around her were fully committed to safeguarding her well-being. The weight of responsibility was immense, but so too was the support structure carefully established to uphold her. As night fell, the palace seemed to exhale, the quiet echo of footfalls and distant conversations providing a tenuous sense of normalcy. Yet beneath the calm, the aides knew that the storm was far from over. Charlotte's revelation had exposed fractures in the carefully maintained facade of royalty, cracks that could widen into a chasm of scrutiny, scandal, and potential historical reckoning. Every decision made, every precaution taken, was part of a delicate dance to navigate the unprecedented situation with intelligence, empathy, and foresight. In her private chambers, Charlotte reflected on the day's events. She was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally, yet a quiet determination had taken root within her. She understood that the truth she carried was not just a personal burden. It was a force with the power to reshape perceptions, challenge legacies, and demand accountability. Even in moments of fear, she felt a growing sense of purpose, a recognition that her role, though extraordinary and unwanted, was pivotal in a story far larger than herself. And so, as the palace settled into the quiet of night, the aides' dilemma remained unresolved, a tension between protection and action, secrecy and disclosure, caution and courage. They were custodians of not just Charlotte's safety, but of a revelation that could reverberate across history, a secret so profound that it threatened to alter everything the monarchy had long claimed as immutable. Each aide, each guardian, each observer knew that the coming days would test their judgment, loyalty, and resilience in ways none of them could yet imagine. Charlotte, though still very young, understood it too. She had heard words no child should ever hear, carried knowledge that no child should be expected to contain, and faced choices that would shape not just her own life, but the narrative of a monarchy forever changed by a single whisper in the quiet of a palace night. The stage was set, the players aware of their stakes, and the delicate, dangerous dance of truth and power had only just begun. The days following Charlotte's revelation were unlike any the palace had endured in recent memory. A sense of quiet unrest hung over every corridor, drifting through rooms adorned with centuries of history, whispering secrets into the polished wood paneling and gilded frames that lined the walls. Staff moved with heightened vigilance, yet beneath their disciplined movements was a palpable tension that no training could entirely suppress. The aides had prepared for practicalities, security, documentation, psychological support, but the intangible weight of uncertainty, of anticipation, proved far more challenging to manage. News, or rather the threat of news, circulated in hushed tones. Staff who had always taken pride in their discretion now found themselves caught in the subtle turbulence of gossip and rumor. Every footstep outside a chamber, every soft murmur in the hallway, became a potential spark that could ignite a firestorm. The palace had always operated under layers of control, with loyalty enforced not merely through duty, but through an intricate web of privilege and secrecy. Yet the events of recent days had disrupted that equilibrium, leaving even the most seasoned personnel questioning who could be trusted and what might soon emerge. For Charlotte, life had become a careful choreography of observation and restraint. Each interaction was scrutinized by the aides, each glance measured, each word weighed for its potential consequences. The governess, acutely aware of the child's emotional and cognitive capacity, guided Charlotte through routines that were at once comforting and restrictive. Playtime was carefully scheduled. Books were selected not only for learning but for emotional grounding, and interactions with other royal children or staff were moderated to prevent inadvertent exposure. Charlotte, however, displayed a resilience that both surprised and impressed those tasked with her care. She adapted quickly, internalizing protocols and demonstrating a maturity far beyond her years, even as the burden of secrecy weighed heavily upon her. Amid this delicate balance, the palace's senior aides convened more frequently, their meetings now longer, more intense, and increasingly strategic. They were navigating a labyrinth in which every decision had historical implications. The initial question of belief had evolved into a more complex calculus: how to validate Charlotte's account, how to protect her from potential repercussions, and how to anticipate the reactions of Camilla, whose reach and influence could not be underestimated. The aides recognized that even a single misstep could cascade into a crisis affecting not only the immediate family but public perception, media scrutiny, and the broader monarchy. The governess proposed a controlled exercise in recollection. Charlotte was asked to recount, once more, her observations of the night in question. She did so with remarkable clarity, her narrative unflinching in detail, her tone measured yet infused with the emotional gravity of her discovery. Every phrase was noted, every hesitation catalogued, every glance or change in expression meticulously documented. The legal consultant emphasized the importance of this record, not merely as a safeguard for the child, but as a potential cornerstone in any future inquiry. It was an extraordinary and almost surreal responsibility, the words of a 7-year-old princess potentially shaping the course of royal history. Security measures were intensified even further. Access to Charlotte was now mediated through layers of trusted personnel, rotations carefully arranged to avoid lapses in vigilance. Surveillance of palace entrances was upgraded, and communication protocols were refined to prevent leaks. The aides operated with the precision of a military operation, yet they remained acutely aware that no system, however sophisticated, could account for human unpredictability. Camilla, with her intelligence and network, posed a variable that could not be fully controlled: The aides prepared for scenarios in which attempts might be made to manipulate, intimidate, or otherwise influence Charlotte. In parallel, a more subtle form of palace turbulence began to unfold. Other members of the royal family, previously unaware of the details Charlotte had revealed, started to sense that something was amiss. Small changes in scheduling, heightened security, and uncharacteristic solemnity among the aides created ripples that could not be contained. Questions were raised discreetly, and while the truth remained guarded, the atmosphere was saturated with a tension that made ordinary interactions charged with caution. Charlotte's revelation, though confined, had begun to permeate the palace in ways that no one could have predicted. Meanwhile, Camilla herself appeared outwardly unperturbed, maintaining the poise and composure expected of her station. Yet beneath the carefully curated exterior, those closest to her noticed subtle signs of unease. Brief moments of hesitation, rapid consultations with advisors, and an increased reliance on trusted confidants hinted at a mind actively strategizing in response to unseen threats. She was navigating a landscape in which the stakes had suddenly escalated, and while she maintained appearances, the palace was now a chessboard, each piece maneuvered with careful calculation. The media, though ostensibly kept at bay, remained a distant but constant presence in the aide's strategic considerations. Even the hint of a leak could trigger a cascade of speculation, with public narratives forming in real time, independent of verification or accuracy. A single mischaracterization of Charlotte's account could have explosive consequences, undermining years of carefully maintained image management and public perception. The aides were acutely aware of the precarious balance between secrecy and disclosure, between safeguarding a child and managing a monarchy under scrutiny. The palace's internal communications were streamlined, with secure channels established for rapid dissemination of critical information. Every member of Charlotte's support team had clear protocols for reporting anomalies, unexpected interactions, or signs of distress. These measures were implemented not as a reflection of distrust among staff, but as a recognition that the environment itself had shifted and that vigilance was paramount. The aides, while maintaining professionalism and decorum, were now operating under a heightened sense of existential responsibility for the safety, reputation, and well-being of everyone involved. Charlotte herself, despite the weight of secrecy and the intensity of the surrounding adult world, displayed moments of resilience and insight that astonished even her most experienced caretakers. She asked thoughtful questions about fairness, justice, and consequence, revealing a precocious understanding of morality and accountability. The governess carefully guided these discussions, balancing honesty with age-appropriate explanations and reinforcing the importance of discretion. Each conversation was both a lesson in prudence and a reinforcement of Charlotte's agency, helping her navigate a world that demanded both courage and caution. Within the palace, the ripple effects of Charlotte's revelation extended into every sphere of operation. Housekeeping, catering, maintenance, and security all experienced subtle but significant shifts in workflow and protocol. Every corridor was scrutinized for potential vulnerabilities, every interaction observed for signs of irregularity. The aides recognized that the palace itself, long considered a stable and controlled environment, had become a dynamic, unpredictable ecosystem, responsive to the invisible tension emanating from the young princess's disclosure. Even the seemingly mundane rituals of daily life were transformed. Meals were planned with care, ensuring both nutrition and security. Study sessions were scheduled to avoid overlap with high-traffic areas. Recreational time was structured to allow relief without exposure. The constant layering of precautionary measures created an environment of controlled intensity, a delicate equilibrium that balanced protection with normalcy. The aides understood that the psychological impact on Charlotte could be as significant as any external threat, and thus every decision was made with dual focus, safeguarding both body and mind. As the days unfolded, the palace continued to operate under a dual narrative. On the surface, ceremonies, meetings, and daily routines proceeded as expected, preserving an outward appearance of stability and normalcy. Beneath this veneer, however, a complex, high-stakes negotiation of information, loyalty, and protection was underway. The aides moved with careful precision, anticipating potential moves by Camilla, preparing for media exposure, and managing the delicate needs of a child whose insight had altered the very fabric of palace life. Late one evening, as shadows stretched across the ornate walls and the palace quieted in the late hour, the aides convened once more. Charts, timelines, and reports were reviewed, strategies reassessed, and contingency plans updated. The gravity of their mission, the unprecedented nature of the challenge, and the enormity of the stakes pressed down with a weight that seemed almost tangible. Charlotte, asleep in her carefully secured chambers, remained the linchpin of this unfolding narrative, a young figure whose courage and clarity had set in motion forces far beyond her years. The palace had entered a state of vigilant readiness. Every day, every decision, and every movement carried layers of significance. The aides, though exhausted, remained resolute, understanding that their duty extended beyond routine service to a child, into the realm of safeguarding truth, legacy, and the future of the monarchy itself. Charlotte's revelation had not merely exposed a secret. It had altered the trajectory of palace life, compelling all who served within its walls to confront an extraordinary and historic challenge. In this state of controlled chaos, the palace endured, its halls echoing with the quiet intensity of preparation, its corridors alive with the tension of vigilance, and its staff engaged in an unspoken but universally understood mission to protect a child, manage an unprecedented truth, and navigate a world where the boundaries between secrecy and revelation had irrevocably shifted. The days ahead promised no relief, only the continued testing of courage, loyalty, and the delicate art of balancing truth with survival, as the palace braced itself for the inevitable confrontation that Charlotte's revelation had set into motion. The palace had always been a place of meticulously guarded secrets, a labyrinth of whispers, shadows, and carefully orchestrated narratives. Yet in the days following Princess Charlotte's revelation, even the most impervious layers of secrecy began to show cracks. It started subtly, an aide noticing a folder slightly out of place, a forgotten note slipped beneath a desk, a time-stamped photograph in a ledger that did not belong. Each discovery, though seemingly minor, carried enormous potential. It was as if the very walls of the palace were conspiring to reveal the truth, to illuminate the hidden machinations that had long been carefully obscured. Charlotte, aware that she had shared something that could change everything, remained in a delicate balance of curiosity and caution. She watched the adults around her with the keen eye of a child attuned to the subtleties of human behavior. She observed glances exchanged behind closed doors, the tightness in shoulders, the way conversations would suddenly fall silent when she approached. Though she was young, Charlotte possessed an innate understanding of the gravity of her own knowledge, a sense that she carried a responsibility far greater than any child should bear. The first tangible evidence emerged when one of the senior aides, reviewing Charlotte's detailed account, decided to cross-reference her statements with historical palace documents and security logs from the night of Princess Diana's fatal crash. What initially appeared as standard procedural diligence quickly revealed anomalies. Communications records that had been assumed routine, messages between aides, security dispatches, and internal memos, now displayed discrepancies that aligned disturbingly with Charlotte's recollection. There were inconsistencies in timing, unusual authorizations, and cryptic notes that suggested coordination beyond ordinary palace protocol. The realization hit like a shockwave. The young princess's observations might be corroborated by tangible evidence. The aides, carefully shielding Charlotte from the immediate implications, began to gather materials methodically. Files were cataloged, digital records extracted and stored securely, and historical correspondences meticulously analyzed. Experts in archival research and forensic documentation were discreetly consulted, operating under layers of confidentiality agreements and legal oversight. Every shred of evidence, no matter how minute, was treated as potentially pivotal. They understood that if even a single piece could be validated, it might form the foundation of a broader inquiry into Camilla's alleged actions. Security protocols around the storage and handling of these materials became increasingly stringent. Only a select few were permitted to access the evidence, each movement logged and verified. The aides, acutely aware of Camilla's influence and reach, knew that any breach could compromise both Charlotte's safety and the integrity of the investigation. The palace, usually a place of ceremonial routine and carefully managed appearances, now operated like a high-security intelligence hub, every decision weighed with strategic foresight. Charlotte's own involvement remained tightly managed. While she could not be shielded from the emotional impact of her revelations, the aides carefully controlled the flow of information she received about the evidence-gathering process. Discussions were framed in age-appropriate language, focusing on the importance of honesty, discernment, and patience. Yet, even with these precautions, Charlotte's understanding of consequence and justice deepened daily. She began to ask pointed questions. Why would someone do such a thing? How could adults keep such secrets for so long? Her inquiries, though childlike in phrasing, reflected a sophisticated moral compass, and the aides recognized that they were not only protecting a princess, they were guiding a witness whose insights might carry historical weight. As the evidence began to coalesce, the palace faced another challenge, the question of verification. Charlotte's account was compelling, but in the context of legal scrutiny and potential public exposure, it required corroboration. The aides began to trace lines of communication and interaction, mapping out the relationships, decisions, and potential motives that could have facilitated the events Charlotte described. Every detail was cross-referenced with historical records, media reports, and secondary accounts from those who had been close to the events surrounding Diana's death. The task was monumental, a painstaking process that demanded both precision and discretion. It was during this period that the first external confirmations emerged. Journalists and independent historians, long skeptical of palace transparency, began to uncover archival evidence that aligned, in unexpected ways, with Charlotte's recollections. Some of the documentation was mundane, routine security logs or administrative memos, but within these ordinary artifacts lay subtle anomalies. Unexplained route changes, last-minute permissions, and communications that, when pieced together, suggested a level of orchestration previously unconsidered. While these findings were not yet conclusive, they provided a sense that Charlotte's observations were far from imaginary or exaggerated. The palace, recognizing the potential for both internal and external fallout, convened discreet councils to determine next steps. Legal advisors, historians, security chiefs, and psychological experts were all consulted in a series of confidential meetings. Their objective was clear: to validate the emerging evidence while ensuring Charlotte's safety and the integrity of the investigation. Each recommendation was weighed with meticulous care, every potential outcome modeled, every risk assessed. The stakes were unprecedented. The combination of historical implications, public perception, and the involvement of a minor made the situation extraordinarily delicate. Amid this whirlwind of evidence and preparation, Camilla's own behavior began to shift subtly but noticeably. Those closest to her observed changes in routine, increased consultations with legal counsel, and heightened attention to security. While outwardly composed, she displayed signs of acute awareness that something within the palace had shifted. Advisors noted brief moments of tension, whispered conversations, and the rapid deployment of aides in response to minor incidents. It became clear that Camilla understood, at least intuitively, that a storm was gathering, one that could potentially expose long-buried truths. The aides, aware of these dynamics, doubled their efforts to maintain operational security. Internal communications were encrypted and compartmentalized. Access to Charlotte's living quarters was restricted and monitored. Every interaction involving the princess was documented with meticulous care. They also began to prepare for potential confrontations, rehearsing protocols for scenarios ranging from unauthorized access to attempted influence or intimidation. It was a tense, almost cinematic environment. The palace, long a symbol of controlled grandeur, had become the stage for an unfolding drama that combined historical revelation, moral reckoning, and high-stakes intrigue. Charlotte herself, meanwhile, continued to navigate her daily routines with a mixture of innocence and emerging wisdom. She showed an extraordinary ability to compartmentalize her experiences, engaging in play, study, and social interaction while carrying the weight of knowledge that would challenge even the most seasoned adult. The governess, recognizing the psychological strain, developed new strategies for emotional support, introducing activities designed to foster resilience, focus, and a sense of agency. Each day was structured to provide stability, while simultaneously preparing Charlotte for the responsibilities that her unique position now entailed. The palace environment, once predictable and ceremonial, was now infused with an almost tangible energy of anticipation. Every decision, from scheduling to security, was influenced by the awareness that the evidence Charlotte had prompted might soon become the fulcrum of historical and public reckoning. Staff worked in concert, balancing professionalism with vigilance, their actions informed by a singular awareness that they were now custodians not just of a princess, but of truth itself. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, a picture emerged that was as disturbing as it was compelling. Patterns of behavior, corroborating documents, and Charlotte's own testimony created a narrative that, while not yet fully validated in public, held profound implications. The aides, working tirelessly behind the scenes, understood that this was only the beginning. The story of Princess Diana's death, long shrouded in speculation and rumor, was on the brink of being reframed, and Charlotte's courage and clarity had become the catalyst for a historic reckoning. In the quiet moments between action and observation, the aides reflected on the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them here. A 7-year-old princess, armed with nothing more than acute observation and unflinching honesty, had set in motion a chain of events capable of altering the course of royal history. The evidence, once scattered and seemingly innocuous, now formed a lattice of corroboration, pointing toward truths that had long been buried beneath layers of power, secrecy, and silence. The palace, despite its centuries of tradition, was now in the throes of an unprecedented internal and historical upheaval, each day bringing the promise of revelation and the risk of confrontation. The stage was set, the players positioned, and the tension coiled tightly in every chamber of the palace. Charlotte, at the center of this unfolding drama, continued to navigate her world with courage and clarity, supported by aides whose vigilance and discretion had become extraordinary in both scope and intensity. The evidence, now methodically collected and cross-referenced, began to hint at a narrative that, when fully revealed, could challenge everything the public thought they knew. And yet, despite the gravity of the situation, there was an unspoken understanding among the aides that the truth, no matter how explosive, demanded careful, measured presentation. Charlotte's revelation had opened the door. Now, it was the palace's responsibility to ensure that what lay beyond was handled with both integrity and prudence. The revelation had spread through the palace like wildfire, though in hushed tones, discreet glances, and anxious whispers. Even without official acknowledgement, those closest to Princess Charlotte understood the gravity of what had been shared. The very walls seemed to echo with the weight of secrets that had been buried for decades, and in the corridors where ceremonial elegance had long masked tension, there was now an unmistakable undercurrent of fear. Camilla, once unshakable in her poised and calculated demeanor, began to exhibit subtle yet unmistakable signs of unease. It started with small things, a sudden change in her schedule, an unusual number of private meetings with advisors, and brief but pointed phone calls that carried a sense of urgency. To the casual observer, these might have appeared as routine adjustments, but those attuned to palace dynamics recognized a pattern of calculated stress. Camilla's usually meticulous public composure remained intact, but behind the closed doors of her private chambers, her world was unraveling. The palace, long a fortress of discipline and ceremony, had transformed into a pressure cooker, each whispered word a potential trigger for exposure. The aides responsible for Charlotte's safety and the collection of corroborating evidence worked tirelessly to anticipate every potential move Camilla might make. Their planning extended beyond mere logistics. It included psychological assessments, risk analyses, and contingency strategies. Each action was weighed against the potential for leaks, intimidation, or interference. They knew that Camilla's influence reached far beyond the immediate palace walls. Every decision they made had to account for the possibility of swift countermeasures, for Camilla was no stranger to wielding power to maintain control over sensitive matters. Meanwhile, Charlotte, unaware of the full scope of the anxiety surrounding her revelation, continued to observe the adults around her with remarkable clarity. She noticed the subtle signs of tension, a hand that trembled briefly when holding a document, a gaze darting too quickly toward a listening device, a conversation abruptly cut short as she entered a room. Though she did not yet comprehend the intricate networks of influence and secrecy, she instinctively understood that her knowledge was both potent and dangerous. Her young mind, balancing curiosity with a developing sense of responsibility, began to recognize the stakes. She had become the keeper of a truth that could change the course of royal history. The palace's internal communications system, once used primarily for scheduling, security updates, and ceremonial coordination, became a tool for strategic orchestration. Messages were encrypted, access to sensitive discussions limited to a select few, and any digital trace meticulously monitored. The aide's approach was methodical. Each move was documented, cross-verified, and rehearsed for potential scenarios. Their vigilance was born not only from concern for Charlotte, but also from an acute awareness of the historical implications of her revelation. If word of her discovery reached the public prematurely, the consequences for both the monarchy and the royal family's reputation could be catastrophic. Camilla's reactions, although controlled in public, revealed cracks in her armor when observed closely. Advisors noted subtle signs of distress. A sharp intake of breath when confronted with minor setbacks, fleeting expressions of anxiety during meetings, and a newfound rigidity in posture. Even her speech, carefully measured and refined, occasionally carried a note of tension, a sign that the weight of potential exposure was beginning to press on her. The palace staff, accustomed to maintaining decorum even in high-stakes situations, recognized that Camilla was entering a state of heightened alertness, one that could influence both her decision-making and her interactions with those around her. The aides, aware of these shifts, intensified their focus on safeguarding Charlotte. They implemented rotation schedules to ensure that the princess was never alone in potentially compromising situations, established multiple secure channels for communication, and developed rapid response protocols in case of attempted interference. Every routine, from study sessions to meals, was subtly adapted to minimize risk. The goal was clear. Charlotte's safety and well-being were paramount, for her testimony, or even the perception of her knowledge, held the potential to ignite a public and legal storm. As Camilla's sense of urgency increased, so too did her reliance on trusted confidants. She convened private meetings with legal advisors, security personnel, and long-standing aides, reviewing every possible angle to contain the situation. Each consultation was carried out with meticulous discretion, the language intentionally guarded to prevent inadvertent disclosure. Advisors were instructed to document every recommendation, every concern, and every contingency plan. Yet even in these controlled settings, there was an air of palpable tension. Camilla was acutely aware that any misstep could amplify the already volatile situation. Simultaneously, the palace's legal and historical teams began to delve deeper into archival materials, searching for corroboration of Charlotte's account and potential vulnerabilities in Camilla's historical record. This research extended beyond routine document review, involving cross-referencing decades of communications, media reports, and anecdotal evidence. Every photograph, security log, and handwritten note was examined for inconsistencies, anomalies, or patterns that could support the young princess's testimony. The process was painstaking, but the stakes demanded nothing less than exhaustive precision. Within this charged atmosphere, the psychological weight on those involved intensified. Aides found themselves balancing extreme discretion with the need for rapid action, navigating the delicate intersection of duty, loyalty, and the unprecedented involvement of a child in matters of profound historical significance. Their decisions carried both immediate and long-term consequences, and every miscalculation had the potential to jeopardize Charlotte's safety, the integrity of the investigation, or the broader public perception of the monarchy. Charlotte's observations, though simple in nature, had become a lens through which the palace now interpreted behavior. Every meeting, every document, and every interaction was seen in light of her revelation. A once predictable environment had transformed into a network of subtle signals, coded language, and carefully monitored behavior. Even ordinary routines, tea service, hallway transitions, and ceremonial preparations, were now analyzed for potential meaning or hidden agendas. The palace operated with an intensity and focus reminiscent of a high-stakes intelligence operation, each action calibrated to protect the princess and preserve the integrity of the emerging narrative. Camilla's anxiety, though veiled in formality, inevitably began to influence her interactions with the royal family. Her decisions became more calculated, her public appearances carefully choreographed, and her private movements shrouded in increased secrecy. Staff noted the subtle changes. A reluctance to engage in informal conversation, heightened scrutiny of documentation, and a persistent review of all communications for potential vulnerabilities. It became increasingly clear that Camilla recognized the fragility of her position, the possibility that decades of carefully managed reputation could be compromised in an instant. In the midst of this upheaval, Charlotte remained a paradoxical figure of calm and insight. Her awareness of adult behavior, coupled with a growing understanding of consequence and responsibility, allowed her to navigate the heightened tension with remarkable poise. Though she was shielded from the full scope of the palace's internal maneuvers, she was acutely aware that her knowledge had set in motion a chain of events that was as perilous as it was historic. Her ability to observe, reflect, and respond with measured clarity became a silent anchor for those guiding the investigation, reinforcing the delicate balance between protection and disclosure. The palace, once a symbol of impenetrable tradition and ritual, had transformed into a nexus of suspense, strategic planning, and moral reckoning. Charlotte's revelation had disrupted centuries of protocol, challenging assumptions, exposing vulnerabilities, and forcing both advisors and royals to confront truths long deferred. Every interaction, every decision, and every precaution taken was informed by the realization that history itself hung in the balance, and that the actions of a 7-year-old princess could reverberate far beyond the palace walls. In these days of intense preparation and anticipation, it became evident that the palace would never be the same. Charlotte's courage and clarity had shattered the veneer of invulnerability, revealing the human complexities, fears, and moral dilemmas that lay beneath centuries of ceremony. The evidence she had inspired to be collected, the meticulous strategies developed to protect her, and the heightened vigilance of every aide and advisor had created an environment charged with tension, anticipation, and historical significance. The stage was set for a confrontation that could redefine the narrative surrounding one of the most infamous events in modern royal history, and Charlotte, young yet perceptive, stood at the epicenter of a story that would resonate for generations. News traveled fast once the information about Charlotte's revelation reached authorities. What started as hushed whispers within the palace had, through channels both official and clandestine, reached law enforcement agencies who had been quietly monitoring high-level intelligence for years. The revelation that Princess Charlotte had allegedly overheard Queen Camilla admitting to involvement in Princess Diana's tragic crash was unprecedented, both in content and consequence. It immediately triggered a flurry of procedural action, as the implications were monumental. A living monarch facing allegations connected to one of the most infamous events in modern history. The palace itself became a hub of activity. Security protocols were tightened to levels never before seen, with increased surveillance on both public and private areas. Every corridor, door, and hallway was meticulously monitored. The aides who had been working tirelessly to protect Charlotte now faced the impossible task of ensuring her safety while allowing law enforcement access to secure information. They coordinated in shifts, covering every angle to prevent leaks, missteps, or sudden confrontations that could endanger the young princess. Every decision was weighed with caution, every move rehearsed for potential outcomes. Camilla, on the other hand, remained outwardly composed but internally unraveling. The news of a pending arrest reached her through the palace's secure channels, leaving her with little room to maneuver. The usual channels of power and influence, trusted advisors, loyal aides, and discreet legal counsels, were now limited by the reality that her alleged actions were under direct scrutiny. The strategic advantage she had long relied upon was gone. Every calculated step she had taken to maintain control was now subject to examination, and every former ally suddenly became a potential threat to her carefully curated image. The arrest itself was dramatic, swift, and heavily controlled. Officers approached with precision, fully aware of the sensitivity surrounding a member of the royal household. Every movement was choreographed to avoid public spectacle while ensuring compliance with the law. Camilla, guided by palace legal counsel, followed instructions with a measured demeanor, though the strain was visible in the subtle tightening of her jaw and the slight tremor in her hands. Cameras and media personnel, kept at a careful distance, captured the scene in grainy footage that would soon circulate globally, creating a media frenzy that could hardly be contained. Public reaction was instantaneous. News outlets, social media platforms, and international broadcasters amplified the story at an unprecedented rate. The idea that Queen Camilla might have had a hand in the events leading to Princess Diana's death sent shockwaves across the world. Headlines screamed with a mixture of disbelief, outrage, and morbid fascination. Analysts speculated on the political ramifications, historians revisited decades-old reports, and conspiracy theorists seized upon every possible detail. The story dominated every channel, leaving the global audience riveted by the unfolding drama. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was a blend of tension, disbelief, and strategic calculation. Advisors scrambled to manage the optics. Legal teams strategized around potential charges, and communications experts worked to frame the narrative in a way that minimized public outrage while maintaining protocol. The delicate balance of royal dignity and legal obligation created an environment of constant pressure, as each decision carried consequences that could affect public perception, historical record, and internal power dynamics. Charlotte, shielded from the chaos, was monitored more closely than ever. Her aides, understanding both the psychological impact and the security implications, ensured she was never alone in moments of high stress. Yet despite the controlled environment, the young princess began to comprehend the gravity of her position. She sensed that the words she had overheard, the truth she had inadvertently carried, were now the epicenter of a global storm. The realization was heavy, even for someone so young, and yet Charlotte displayed remarkable resilience, navigating the complex emotions of fear, responsibility, and curiosity with an almost uncanny composure. The legal implications of Camilla's arrest were profound. Authorities faced unprecedented challenges, including questions of royal immunity, jurisdiction, and historical accountability. Special prosecutors were convened to handle the delicate situation, consulting with constitutional experts, historical advisors, and forensic analysts to establish a procedural path that could withstand both legal scrutiny and public criticism. Every decision, from the timing of formal charges to the handling of sensitive evidence, was scrutinized under the dual pressures of law and public opinion. Media outlets, meanwhile, intensified their coverage, with reporters digging through historical archives, royal biographies, and first-hand accounts from former aides and staff. Every photograph, every letter, every offhand comment became a potential piece of evidence in a story that had captivated millions. Social media platforms amplified speculation, debate, and outrage, creating a feedback loop in which every new detail was dissected, analyzed, and shared. The world watched not only to learn what had transpired, but to witness the unraveling of a narrative that had remained largely hidden for decades. International reactions were equally significant. World leaders, diplomats, and global commentators expressed varying degrees of concern, often walking a tightrope between acknowledging the legal process and respecting the sovereignty of the British monarchy. Analysts debated the long-term impact on public trust, diplomatic relations, and historical narratives surrounding Princess Diana's death. The arrest of a reigning monarch, even temporarily, was virtually unheard of, and the event sent shockwaves through institutions accustomed to centuries of ceremonial continuity and stability. Inside the palace, Camilla's inner circle worked feverishly to protect her reputation while complying with legal requirements. Crisis management teams were activated, carefully crafting statements, coordinating interviews, and preparing for the inevitable public scrutiny. Advisors rehearsed potential questions, simulated media appearances, and created contingency plans for the possible release of sensitive information. Every detail was considered, from the choice of words in official statements to the arrangement of security personnel, reflecting the extraordinary pressures of balancing legality, optics, and tradition. Charlotte's role in the unfolding drama was both critical and precarious. Her testimony, while indirectly conveyed through careful documentation and observation, became a focal point for both investigators and advisors. The insights she had provided, previously viewed as incidental, were now central to understanding the scope and nature of Camilla's alleged actions. Every interaction she observed, every nuance she detected, was meticulously recorded and analyzed. The young princess, navigating the intersection of innocence and revelation, became both a witness and a catalyst for historical reckoning. Throughout these days, the palace was a crucible of emotion, strategy, and secrecy. The intersection of legal obligations, public scrutiny, and personal stakes created a dynamic that was as unpredictable as it was historic. Charlotte's overhearing of Camilla's confession had triggered a cascade of events that no advisor, aide, or royal family member could have fully anticipated. The arrest, while a controlled and calculated maneuver, represented the apex of tension, a convergence of decades-old secrets and contemporary accountability that would reverberate through generations. The global public, meanwhile, remained riveted. News cycles were dominated by live coverage, in-depth analyses, and expert commentary. Former palace insiders, journalists, and historians weighed in, offering perspectives that ranged from cautious skepticism to outright condemnation. Social media erupted with debate, speculation, and emotional reaction, creating a virtual arena in which narratives were constructed, challenged, and reshaped in real time. The arrest of Queen Camilla, precipitated by the candid observations of a 7-year-old princess, had transformed a long-standing historical tragedy into an unfolding, contemporary spectacle of unprecedented magnitude. The arrest of Queen Camilla sent seismic tremors throughout the royal household. What had always been a carefully choreographed world of tradition, hierarchy, and secrecy now erupted into a maelstrom of fear, disbelief, and uncertainty. Within the palace walls, corridors that once carried only whispers of protocol were now filled with hurried footsteps, urgent consultations, and hushed, tense conversations that betrayed the gravity of the situation. Family members, aides, and advisors all wrestled with the unprecedented reality. A reigning monarch facing accusations tied to one of the most tragic events in modern British history. Prince William, Prince Harry, and other senior members of the royal family found themselves at the intersection of loyalty, legacy, and moral responsibility. The brothers, already burdened by decades of public scrutiny and personal struggle, now faced an entirely new layer of emotional turmoil. Their mother's tragic death, long shrouded in mystery and speculation, had always been a source of grief and unanswered questions. Now, with Charlotte's revelation, those questions had transformed into shocking assertions that struck at the very heart of their family's integrity. Every conversation they had with aides, every internal meeting they attended, was now overshadowed by the weight of historical implications and the potential consequences of the unfolding legal and public spectacle. The palace staff, many of whom had served in silence for decades, were equally unsettled. The delicate equilibrium that had maintained a sense of order and stability was shattered. Trust, a cornerstone of palace operations, was suddenly in question. Advisors and security personnel had to navigate a labyrinth of responsibilities, protecting Charlotte, ensuring the arrest proceeded without incident, maintaining the dignity of the royal family, and managing the inevitable public and media scrutiny. Each decision carried a dual risk: the immediate safety and welfare of the princess, and the long-term reputational consequences for the monarchy itself. Camilla's inner circle faced perhaps the greatest challenge. Legal teams worked feverishly to prepare defenses and strategize around royal immunity, historical precedent, and procedural constraints. Public relations experts scrambled to contain the narrative, carefully crafting statements that could acknowledge legal realities without undermining the Queen's stature or inflaming public opinion. Advisors had to anticipate every possible scenario, from courtroom confrontations to media leaks, from public outrage to private betrayals within the household. The palace had entered a state of high alert, a level of vigilance never previously documented in modern royal history. Meanwhile, Charlotte's role remained delicate yet pivotal. As the only direct witness to what she had allegedly overheard, the young princess became both the center of protective attention and the fulcrum upon which the unfolding drama balanced. Her aides, understanding the psychological pressures she faced, ensured constant supervision, mental and emotional support, and controlled exposure to information that could overwhelm her. They carefully mediated interactions, choosing words and explanations with precision to shield her from unnecessary distress while maintaining her awareness of the gravity of the situation. The combination of innocence, insight, and responsibility created a tension that was both fragile and profound. The global media frenzy escalated in tandem with palace proceedings. Each update was dissected, debated, and broadcast worldwide. Social media became a virtual battlefield of opinions, speculations, and conspiracy theories. Every gesture, facial expression, and offhand comment was scrutinized for hidden meanings, potential admissions, or signs of culpability. Journalists pursued every lead, from historical palace records to first-hand accounts of aides and staff, attempting to reconstruct the timeline and uncover corroborative evidence. The public, emotionally invested in the saga of Diana's death for decades, washed with a mix of horror, fascination, and relentless curiosity. International observers reacted with a combination of astonishment and caution. Diplomats, political analysts, and global leaders followed the situation closely, balancing the principles of international diplomacy with the unprecedented legal and ethical questions emerging from the British monarchy. The arrest challenged centuries of royal immunity, traditional protocol, and historical narrative. It raised profound questions about accountability, transparency, and the intersection of personal actions with public responsibility. Even outside the United Kingdom, the implications were being studied, debated, and anticipated with a level of intensity rarely seen in global affairs. Inside the palace, the emotional impact was palpable. Conversations that had once been measured, polite, and formal now carried a sharp edge of urgency and fear. Family dynamics were strained as members struggled to reconcile decades of loyalty and affection with the emerging allegations. Private conversations between William and Harry, in particular, were tinged with both sorrow and incredulity. They wrestled with the knowledge that Charlotte, their young niece, had inadvertently become the bearer of a revelation that could reshape public understanding of their family history. The emotional weight was staggering, compounded by the fact that public eyes were not only watching but dissecting every moment, word, and reaction.